Welcome to Energy Insights. In this episode, we speak with Ulka Kelkar. Ulka is the Executive Director of Climate at the World Resources Institute, India. She's an economist with 24 years of experience in climate change research, outreach, and capacity building. Ulka works on low-carbon development pathways, sub-national climate action, and just transitions in small industry. Previously, Ulka worked in climate change at the Asian Development Bank and has been involved in projects with several organisations that have worked on issues across India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Nepal. Her research has also appeared in journals such as the Annual Review of Environment and Resources, Global Environmental Change, and Climate Policy and Mitigation and Adaptation Strategies for Global Change. We spoke about the headline topics surrounding the recently concluded COP28 climate conference in Dubai, including the controversy surrounding the appointment of Sultan Al-Jaber as the conference's president, the final adopted text that referred to transitioning away from fossil fuels, the new loss and damage fund, climate finance, and many other topics. It was great speaking to Ulka to get her thoughts on these topics. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, we are here with Ulka Kelkar. Ulka, thank you so much for coming back on Energy Insights. We had you here about a year ago now, I think it was.
That's right. Thank you. It's very nice to be back, especially right after COP28.
Great. Thanks, Ulka. So, Ulka, just before we get started, I'm just wondering if you could give listeners who don't know who you are a brief description of your background and what you're working on, who you're working with right now.
Certainly. So I work with WRI India, World Resources Institute India, and I'm based in Bangalore in South India. I've been with WRI for about 5-6 years now, leading their climate program. And I'm an economist by training. I've been in the climate economics and policy field for more than 20 years now.
Awesome. So I'd really like to pick your brain today on all things COP28, which just wrapped up. But I think just before we get into the details about what happened at the conference, I think it'd be nice to get a lay of the land and go back a little bit earlier in 2023 and just talk about the COP presidency. And there was a significant level of controversy surrounding the leadership at the conference. Now, the chosen president was the UAE's Sultan Al-Jaber. I was just wondering if you could give us a brief description on why this was, ruffled so many feathers, so to speak, in different circles.
Right. So the presidency of the COP is always a very important position. I think one of the reasons is that the COP presidency actually plays a very significant role sometimes in deciding the agenda, in circulating working drafts for negotiators to consider, in maybe breaking through certain deadlocks, facilitating even the whole style by which they include more stakeholders other than negotiators. So every COP has its own flavor, its own style, some of which is practical limitations decided by the venue. Others are really masterminded by the COP presidency. So it's a very important role, not just to host a conference. I think in this case, one of the misgivings that was there initially was that the president would also be retaining his day job, his full-time role as someone who leads a fossil fuel company. Now, this is something that could possibly be a conflict of interest, and that's why a lot of civil society groups were a little concerned about it. But to my mind, this is something which is a reality that we have to live with. In many cases, the COP host is the Environment Ministry of the government that hosts the COP. But looking forward, the kinds of changes that need to happen, more and more the energy ministries need to come in. And in many of our countries, the energy ministries are, of course, largely, dealing with fossil fuels. So this is a reality, I think, that we have to contend with. And I think civil society, the media in particular, play a very important role as watchdogs, as making sure that, any possible conflict of interest is, it comes to light. So yes, it was a slightly contentious situation where all eyes were on the COP presidency in terms of making sure that they, that they do fulfill their role as the environmental champions. and the aspects about current interests in terms of fossil fuel continuation does not actually hamper a breakthrough in the negotiation. So I think that was some of what was on everyone's minds.
What's your, I mean, keeping that in mind, what's your view on the opposing camp's concern? So, for example, on one hand, we had people calling for the removal of the president from the conference. I mean, from the removal of that position from his position, and then you had others like the U.S. climate envoy John Kerry, who was saying that a lot of the criticism was unfair, and that he said, in his words, that working with oil-producing countries is important going forward. What's your view on this? Was the criticism warranted, or was it overblown, or would you tend to agree with what, for example, Senator Kerry said?
No, usually what happens in any role, if there is a possible duality of responsibilities, which could lead to even impressions of conflict of interest, usually if the role is, say, for a year or 2 years, then the person in question might recuse themselves from their other role, which might lead to allegations of a conflict of interest. So, for example, if a businessman becomes the president of the United States, they can, for instance, put their investments in some kind of blind trust, ensure it to someone else to carry on their businesses while they concentrate full time on politics. So there are ways by which to go forward and not to perhaps retain both roles during that particular crucial time. I think that is what would have been perhaps the ideal outcome that many civil society organizations were looking for. But I think I also do feel that most of the COPs have been held in economies that are either dependent on coal or on oil and gas. And that is just a reflection of our current reality, the reality which we are changing and which we need to change even more rapidly as we switch to renewable energy. But Poland, for example, has had several COPs. They, of course, depend heavily on coal in terms of not just their energy, but also in terms of their labor force. And that's why the whole issue of just transition has actually been championed by the Polish presidency in Katowice. Similarly, I think with the oil and gas dependent economies, it is something that we will have to contend head on, and in fact, it so emerged that there was a moment of reckoning at this particular COP, and the language on fossil fuels was actually included. So I think sometimes maybe it helps to have these negotiations really in the crucible of where the action is, where the hard choices have to be made, and where the economies are actually dependent on this kind of energy. And different countries within that region are contending with economic diversification in different ways. So it's actually something like you could think of it almost like a living lab, or something that is an experiment that is in progress. And we really need to take on these issues very sort of face on, and try to find solutions to them.
Now, I mean, I think you mentioned that fossil fuels got mentioned in this final text, or at least the decision that was adopted after the conference has finished. And I think that's a good segue into, I guess, talking about what I wanted to talk about next is, given leadership and contesting views aside, now the dust has kind of settled, and I think the biggest thing that has come out of this COP was, as you said, the mentioning of transitioning away from fossil fuels in the final text. And now it's been known for many, many decades that fossil fuels are the main drivers of climate change. So it's made some people wonder why the hell it's taken so long. I mean, it's been, 30 years around that, in fact, for it to actually make an appearance in any sort of climate text. So I'm just wondering, why do you think this did take as long as it did to come out like this, and how important is this inclusion of fossil fuels in the agreement?
I mean, if we go back to the original treaty, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it talks about preventing dangerous climate change. it doesn't even say what dangerous would look like or what that would mean. It was only subsequently through scientific research and then in the Paris Agreement in 2015, um, several years later, that 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius, these kinds of thresholds were explicitly mentioned. So I think sometimes what happens is that these are all, this is a process that incrementally becomes more specific. Might be easier to negotiate and agree on broader language first. Maybe it is in fact broader in a good way as well. So fossil fuels is of course one of the sources of greenhouse gas emissions, but there are other sources as well. For example, deforestation or agriculture. Um, you know, so in a way, it isn't. I think something that is very hard to imagine that there was agreement first on broader language, and then as we start saying, as in a lot of people also say, enough talk, it's time to move on to action, it's time to implement. As we start looking at what are those pathways to implementation, to actually making those principles of the UNFCCC or the Paris Agreement, how to make them actually operational, then we start coming down to specifics. And what the Paris Agreement did, of course, was to leave the specifics largely to countries. It said every country should have its nationally determined contributions and try to contribute towards the larger global goal in their own way. Um, One of the reasons why this particular COP was different was because that it came right after the global stocktake. A 5-year kind of report card of what has been the outcome of the action of these nationally determined contributions. And the report card was not good enough. We need to accelerate. And one way to accelerate, scale up, make tangible is by starting to lay out some of the specifics. And so I think the time was right. The time was sort of, I would say it was high time that specifics started getting negotiated on. Even then, I think something like fossil fuels has been referred to repeatedly in the scientific reports that inform the UNFCCC. So every time an IPCC report comes out and says, in order to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius, these are the things that you must do. In order to mitigate or adapt, these are the things that you must do. Those reports do inform the negotiations. I think this is the first time that the cover document, the cover agreement, has gone beyond taking note of the science, but actually then spelling out some of the actions that need to be taken explicitly by all countries together. So I think that's why the fossil fuel discussion has come in such a strong way. As to why it has not come in before, apart from the process that I spoke about, I'm sure there were vested interests in from the private sector in not having this sort of language explicitly included. We wouldn't. I wouldn't be privy to any kind of information on it. But yeah, it's again not hard to imagine that this is something that would see a lot of resistance. Um, so yeah, absolutely. These are, I think, different forces that have been at play, and now it's high time that that some of these are spelt out.
Can you picture now going forward? I mean, you mentioned that this is quite broad, right? And can you picture now going forward? So like a future prediction would be that more specifics would get slowly spelled out over time. So for example, you mentioned deforestation, for example, and I know that actually that word got mentioned for the first time actually as well. So can you see it going in a direction of getting down to the more nitty gritty in the future?
So I think we have been seeing a trend of getting more specific. So if we think back to the Glasgow COP, there were commitments that countries made in the Glasgow Pact to submit new and updated NDCs, to submit net zero kind of long-term strategies, something which would be in line with the science, not just something which reflected their own national circumstances. So I think in general there has been a trend towards getting down to more specific timelines, to more specific and common reporting formats so that you can compare. and also to insist on the finance or the means of implementation required in order to make these commitments actually happen. Um, I think all of these, there has been greater and greater discussion about it and greater emphasis on it. Of course, in some cases, like the finance case, there have been huge gaps, which have also been made public, which have also emerged. But going forward, one of the limitations of the UNFCCC, of the UN process, which various COPs have tried to work around, is that often you can have commitments that are adopted by a group of countries and does not necessarily require the consensus of all UN countries on every word. And this workaround is something that takes the form of pledges which happen outside of the COP process. So that's why you would see many announcements being made in the last few COPs, various kinds of breakthroughs, pledges, agendas on specific sectoral actions. So there might be something specifically around steel or hard to abate industry. There might be something specifically around methane, or there might be something as this COP has actually came about specifically related to food. I think this is not ideal in the sense that it is not the formal UN process adopted by consensus and participation of all the countries, taking into account everybody's concerns. But what it does is try to break through the largest emitters, the largest contributors, and perhaps larger economies who are able to contribute through action or through finance. And it brings them together in some kind of coalition of the willing, which then subsequently, by demonstrating that action is possible, might then actually inform the core negotiations under the UN process in subsequent years. So, for example, bringing through subnational governments this time, city mayors, was actually a very symbolic statement because the COP negotiations only involve national governments. They don't consider subnational governments. In some sense, city governments are considered as non-state actors in the UN process. But so much of the action is happening there that if you bring them together and demonstrate some of these good practices, of what's possible, then it might drive greater action, greater ambition within the COP as well. So I think this is what a few think tanks a few years ago called an ambition loop. That is, if you can show what businesses, cities, states, sectors are doing, then it might lead to some of these actions becoming incorporated even in the subsequent COP drafts. So I think that's the kind of thing we'll be seeing more and more of, and hopefully, in the next round of NDCs that's required, some of these actions will be spelled out by different countries. For certain countries, transport might be a major sector to be tackled. Maybe a small source of emissions right now, but a very growing source of emissions. For other countries, it might be something to do with new forms of renewable energy that use the tidal energy or geothermal energy. So it would look different from country to country, and the NDC process does allow for that.
Yeah, no, I think, and also, I mean, all of that news is generally positive when I hear it as well, and I think another thing that was kind of a spot of good news that came out of this COP was also the loss and damage talks and the agreement on setting up a fund that actually came out pretty much as COP28 in Dubai began. And, considering the context of what the world has just gone through in the past year in terms of heat waves, for example, really kind of, I guess, emphasized the need for this, for more action on this loss and damage fund, especially for countries that are particularly vulnerable. Now, we talked a lot about that in our last conversation and quite some time ago now, like back in 2022. But I was just wondering if you could give us a brief kind of description on what happened regarding loss and damage at this COP, and do you think that this is significant progress, or do you think that still a lot more needs to be done in helping developing countries deal with the already present impacts of climate change?
So we've spoken a lot, Ashley, about mitigation, about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, transitioning away from fossil fuels. but less attention is paid in very concrete terms to the adaptation to the impacts of climate change. So when we talked about, very briefly, we touched upon finance. Even now, the bulk of finance tends to be focused on greenhouse gas reduction and not so much on adapting to the impacts of climate change. Couple of reasons for this. One is that greenhouse gas reduction often can be done through technologies, through projects that are actually, that can be packaged as commercial projects. They give you returns because saving of energy means saving of money. The adaptation actions are not so easily packaged as projects. Often they involve very diffuse, spread out actors. Could be lots of subsistence farmers, lot of villages which need their water supply to become more resilient. A lot of very diffused, for example, the health sector, sectors which are often in the social kind of sense. So that has been one of the issues that has been brought up and highlighted, that adaptation finance is currently only about a fifth of total finance. It needs a lot more of public finance, grant money, and it needs to become at least half of total climate finance. Now, in all of this, we don't talk about the third aspect, which is loss and damage, namely loss of lives and damage to property that is already happening now due to climate events that have become more frequent or more severe because of the cumulative emissions that have already been built up in the atmosphere over the last 100 years, and the kind of changes in temperature and more erratic weather that we're already beginning to see, and that this is likely to become worse and worse in the next few years. So this isn't about adapting to or preparing for future risks due to climate change or making things more resilient. It is about actually dealing with losses and damages that are being experienced right now. So one of the reasons that there was so much resistance to this was not originally actually spelled out as such in the UNFCCC or subsequent documents, but many vulnerable countries and civil society organizations have been championing this cause for several decades. And the reason for this resistance was that it kind of opens the doors towards litigation on compensation. So a significant breakthrough was made in the Glasgow COP, where for the first time, some regional governments and some philanthropies actually advanced money for loss and damage. So for the first time, this was recognized symbolically, and that itself was a breakthrough. And then at the Sharm el-Sheikh COP, after considerable discussion over whether this could be included in the agenda or not, it was included in the agenda. And by the end of the COP, there was a kind of fund that was created or recognized, a loss and damage fund, and a process was announced. Now, this process did happen over the last year between the Sharm el-Sheikh COP and the Dubai COP, and a transitional committee was set up that actually met 5 times and explored various models by which this fund could actually be set up and could start working right away. Because, as you can imagine, given that these impacts are already being felt, the money needs to reach those who are most vulnerable. It needs to reach them in a timely way. So we can't spend too much time deliberating upon and setting up this entire superstructure of processes that will just hold up the flow of finance. It needs to be something that is transparent, but that is also fit for purpose. So that's the kind of discussion that happened over the last year. Various previous models were considered. For example, we do have the Green Climate Fund, and various options were considered. There was, of course, a lot of debate about it. And finally, at this particular COP, some of the recommendations of these transitional committees were adopted. The fund, in some sense, has been operationalized. And I think on the first day of the COP itself, various countries came with announcements of pledges that they would make to this loss and damage fund. Most of these, of course, were from developed countries, but even the UAE, the host country, also advanced $100 million towards this fund. It was also decided that the World Bank would be the interim sort of host agency for this fund. So I think what has been very impressive is the speed by which an idea has gone from something that people were not even willing to discuss in the COP negotiations to actually having a pool of money and a process ready by which to transfer that money to where it is needed the most. Of course, given the scale of the problem, the funding that has already gone in is not adequate by any means. More and more reports are coming out by countries which estimate how much funding is required, and it's really just a drop in the ocean. But an important start has been made, and an important process is in place. And now it is required that on the one hand there is more funding coming into this fund, into this pool, and on the other hand, countries, especially the most vulnerable countries, also build the capacity to be able to access these funds. So we have a lot to learn from previous experiences of international climate finance, and we can build on that very quickly.
Speaking of international climate finance too, there was, depending on who you ask, there was a bit of celebration about developed countries, finally reaching the 100 billion a year climate finance promise to developing countries, this year in 2023. But I think when we keep in mind, the many, many years of shortfalls of not reaching that figure doesn't really make it a significant milestone in given that context. But given the fact that, as you mentioned, that, even if we just talk about the loss and damage fund, it's still a drop in the ocean. Like there's the scale of required resources needed is so much more. So what I actually wanted to ask is that, do you think that, for example, this $100 billion a year promise is even, is this actually something that should still be, strived for? Is it even relevant still? I mean, what's your reaction to all of this, or does something else need to?
I think there are three things to be done. One is, yes, absolutely, the $100 billion shortfall needs to be made up. We can't just forget about past promises. It was, at its time, always thought of as a first step, as a symbolic gesture, as something that, once you start with this, you can build trust, you can show action, and then you can build on it. And it didn't happen. And there are always circumstances, right? There's always economic reasons, geopolitical reasons, and so on. But one can't just forget about past promises. The whole architecture of these climate negotiations is actually based on trust. Very little in the Paris Agreement is legally binding. The only thing that countries are required to do that's legally binding is actually to be able to report on what they're doing. So if you kind of don't meet these promises, then the whole thing really doesn't make sense and doesn't inspire confidence, doesn't inspire others to do more. So absolutely, one needs to meet that target to make up for that shortfall. But already, I think since 2018, there are discussions about a new stream of negotiations on the new collective goal, new collective quantified goals in climate finance, which is namely to go beyond this $100 billion pledge, whose deadline was, it was for 2020, but to start talking about 2025 and beyond. And there have been various formulae that have been put forward by different agencies. Some say $500 billion is a worthwhile goal to negotiate. $500 billion per year. Sorry, the previous one was $100 billion per year. Others say there must be a formula based on countries' contributions to emissions. Others say that all of this is again very little compared to the kinds of estimates that are coming in countries' reports about how much funding is needed, which runs into the trillions. So that's why I think a lot of discussion has been happening in the last 2 years, particularly on a third stream, which so far is largely out of the COP negotiations, which is how do you raise additional sources of funding and how do you make all finance green finance and aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. This has led to some very interesting discussions about taxing, for example, shipping or aviation, or a windfall tax on fossil fuels, or taxing business class or first class travel, even a minimum corporate tax on all organizations, all businesses. There have been talks about in the IMF and World Bank about changing their processes, making more funding available, in a more timely way, having less restrictive paperwork, for example. Um, in the IMF, using special drawing rights as a currency to create a resilience trust that countries can draw upon. So in many cases, discussions are more advanced, as in for the IMF Resilience Trust. In other cases, discussions need to actually be finalized. For example, on the various kinds of taxation that I talked about, they would have to be discussed in different forums, different treaties, not just the UNFCCC. But this third area, which is going beyond the past $100 billion and going beyond the future COP negotiated climate finance target, talks about raising or unlocking much more climate finance, much more finance that can be used towards climate purposes, because that's the scale that will be required. It also includes discussions about reducing the funding going to fossil fuel new projects. So reducing subsidies for new fossil fuel projects, reducing the funding for new fossil fuel projects. And so that's why there are a lot of actions being taken even by banks and even by central banks of countries. So yeah, the climate finance discussion is going to be something to really keep an eye on this year. And many experts in this field are beginning to call the next COP, which will be held in Baku in Azerbaijan, as the climate finance COP, because many of these discussions will come to some kind of conclusion, or should at least come up with recommendations by then. So something to look out for.
So being mindful of your time, Ulka, and also being mindful of an eye on the future, I just wanted to get your last general take on the entire COP28 conference itself. Now, there are what I would call mixed feelings about the overall outcome. I mean, some people are happy, some people are really not very happy. I mean, for example, some small island states mentioned their disappointment with the final text not being ambitious enough, while some others are saying that the text could spur strong market signals that fossil fuels are indeed on a lifeline, and a future without them is indeed in sight. So I'm just wondering what your take is on all of this. How do you view the outcomes that recently happened, and do you think we're going in the right direction?
I don't know. I try to be optimistic, but sometimes, yeah, it's a bit hard. I feel that even though many of us think that it's the COP that is signaling to the market or to the world, I sometimes wonder if the COPs are actually one step behind, and the world has changed, and the COP is just kind of catching up. So I feel that there are a lot of trends happening in the real world, which are very promising. A lot of action happening in the finance sector that we spoke about, business sector, cities, and even people's awareness about their own behaviors, their own lifestyle choices. I think it's a little bit of a self. It's a loop that feeds in on itself. That the COP formalizes some of the trends, some of the changes that are happening in the world, and that in fact gives a formal direction to many policies in countries, in individual countries, that can support some of the trends that are already happening in business and in cities. So, I mean, just to give a simple example, electric mobility, electric vehicles, we're seeing a lot of momentum in the market, not just in countries of the West, which use, say, four-wheelers, cars, but even in countries like mine, where people are beginning to think of electric two-wheelers, electric buses, which is very important for public transport. Now, if the COP takes this into account and comes up with discussion with recommendations on sustainable transport, on zero emission vehicles, then that actually gives a kind of assurance, a kind of certainty to both to buyers of these vehicles as well as to manufacturers of these vehicles, that this is a direction in which they need to move, or they need to diversify. When the individual countries then adopt targets. So, for example, the EU says that from 2035 we'll not sell any more new electric vehicles. Then that kind of becomes self-reinforcing kind of mechanism, from the international policy to the national policy to subnational action, business action, and consumer action. So I see these COPs as a part of a larger set of things that need to happen. I am pretty optimistic that the general direction of movement is all reinforcing each other and headed in the right direction. What we need is some miracle to happen that will speed things up, accelerate things. Let's see if the next year or so brings some of that, either inside the COP or outside it.
Well, I share your optimism, Ulka, and it's always a pleasure to speak to you, and thank you so much for your time and sharing your thoughts on all these important processes and trends that are going on in the world right now.
Thank you very much.
If you found this episode valuable, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, share it with your friends or colleagues, and visit our website at energytracker.asia for more. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time on Energy Insights.